then. Discussion. So yes, as that slide kind of introduced me, I used to work at St Mary's in Portsmouth in the mental health team for Solent NHS Trust. I've now joined the University of Southampton as a researcher and a teacher, so associate professor there. So one of the things I was doing as part of the Portsmouth Mental Health Alliance was working with Sandy and others around trying to join up thinking around sort of debt and poverty and financial difficulties and mental health problems. And this is something I'm working actually with Sandy and Jan on a bit of a project now for Portsmouth as well. So this is something I've been interested in for a few years, and I'm going to really tell you about the impact, the relationship between money and mental health problems, which I'm sure you would all come to see on a day-to-day basis. But I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the research. And I'm going to tell you in particular about my interest as a psychologist about why there is this relationship, not just there is a relationship, but why and the psychology behind it. So people of low socioeconomic status, people in poverty, overall, and this is research from a lot of different countries, have risk of a range of different mental health problems. They're more at risk. In the UK specifically, areas which have higher pockets of deprivation have higher levels of people of deliberate self-harm and psychiatric hospital admissions. Those who are from kind of the lowest socioeconomic position, more deprived background, poverty, are much more likely to develop psychotic illnesses, such as diagnosis of schizophrenia. It's a little bit unclear what comes first. There's the chicken and egg question with a lot of research in psychology, but around this as well. Is it that if you are from a really poor background, a deprived area, you're more likely to develop it? Is it that if you develop something like psychosis and you struggle to hold down a job and you're relying on benefits income, that you have to move to an area, you have to move somewhere which is cheaper, might be a more deprived neighborhood? But I'm going to talk more about this, and there's some evidence that the relationship kind of works both ways. In terms of finances and suicide, recessions overall, I've got the references here just at the end, so if anyone does want to look. Recessions, there's a lot of evidence from various recessions over the years, different countries, increase the risk of common mental health problems such as depression and anxiety, also increase the prevalence of, this is at a population level, substance use problems and suicidal behaviour such as attempts to end life, self-harm. There was an analysis in Greece which showed an increase in suicide rates during a period of a recession and austerity from kind of 2009 onwards, when there was the kind of debt crisis in the euro, etc. This was only for particular age groups. It was men of particular age groups. Yeah, but there was a definite increase. Unemployment is a risk factor for suicide. A study of 10 countries in Europe found that socioeconomic deprivation was linked to higher suicide rates. And a recent study, which was impressive study with worrying results, that the entire population of Sweden, this looked at the entire population of Sweden, and shows that those who are in debt were 2.5 times more likely to end their lives by suicide over the course of a year. Now that's after you take into account other financial variables, age, gender, etc. That's after you control for all of that. There's still something about debt 2.5 times. Now that's what we call the kind of the relative risk. The absolute risk is still very low. So it's 2.5 times more likely, but we're talking about, well under 1%, 0.0 something percent. Okay, so the amount of people who do it is still low, but I was crunching the numbers the other day, and based on my calculations, if this estimate from Sweden holds, we've probably got about 1,800 people a year in the UK in debt who end their lives by suicide every year. So I don't want you to panic in terms of, the number of people in debt who do actually end their lives by suicide is still very small, and it is still significantly higher than people who aren't in debt. Poverty and deprivation. So thinking about depression specifically, this is increased by unemployment, jobs insecurity, bankruptcy, not surprisingly, levels of income, but also financial strain. So whether people can feel like they can get by, whether they can make ends meet and pay the bills. Having to borrow money from informal sources, so borrowing money from friends, etc., and also having a utility disconnected are related to an increase of mental health problems. So those specifically having a utility disconnected, and I think that's very pertinent with all of the news about the increase in, well, generally about the increase in living costs, but in particular, some estimates, I think it's going to nearly double energy costs this year. So thinking about fuel poverty, I'm particularly worried about people in fuel poverty and their mental health in the coming months. Short-term loans, aka payday loans, are also linked to higher levels of anxiety. In terms of the financial impact of COVID, there's not a whole lot actually been done so far. There's maybe a handful of studies. I've got a couple of data sets which I'm going to look at on this. One study of 49,000 adults over the first year of COVID showed that financial worries increased the risk of suicidal thoughts and behaviours such as self-harm. Another study in the USA showed that COVID-related stress, such as not being able to pay the bills, being furloughed, also increased the risk of suicidal ideation. This is people, the general population, so this isn't just people with mental health problems, this is the general population. Another thing to bear in mind is socioeconomic inequality. So a study of 65 countries by the World Health Organization found that rates of depression really varied in countries between levels of income inequality, i.e. the difference between rich and poor. This next graph is, there's something called the Equality Trust. This is from a book which I'm currently reading, and it is pretty mind-blowing, called The Spirit Level, which is by two health economists from the UK, and they use publicly available data to show countries across the world, but also they look at the USA, they look at individual states in the USA to show at a certain point how well, once a country is kind of developed and fairly wealthy, getting more, being richer doesn't actually help a population's health, including mental health. And actually, the more unequal a society is, the more there are a whole range of problems. So this is the proportion of people with any mental health problem. And you can see a very strong correlation there. There are some outliers, such as Italy. But if you see there, the UK, unfortunately, is pretty high on the top, along with the USA, on both mental health problems and how unequal incomes are if you compare kind of the bottom 20% of earners to the top 20% of earners. So what about debt specifically, which I know in your work, citizens advice, is something you're going to be coming across, delivering debt advice a lot. And I know from Sandy, you get hundreds of people a year just for that. So I did a meta-analysis a few years ago. So that is where you basically pull together all the numbers from all the research so far. So I pulled together lots of data from various studies. Overall, people in debt are more than 3 times as likely to have a mental health disorder, a mental health problem. So looking at this is from various studies from various countries, overall on average, about 9% of people with no mental health problem are in debt, compared to 25% of those who are in debt. Or if you look at it the other way, again, we've got the chicken and egg question. 42% of those in debt have a mental health problem, compared to 18% of those not in debt. That's a big proportion there. So, you're just worth considering that the people who are presenting for debt advice are much more likely to be struggling for mental health than the general population of Portsmouth, or maybe even people who are presenting for other non-debt related issues. There's a particular relationship for depression, for suicide attempts and completion as well, for problems with drink and drugs, and for psychotic illnesses as well. So it's overall there's a problem, but for particular mental health problems as well. Now, one of the things I did, which was my doctorate thesis and kickstarted this research of mine, was around when the tuition fees went up in 2011, 2012. If you remember, they kind of, from one year to the next, it went from £3,500 to up to £9,000. And the amount of debt was predicted to sort of double for students. So I followed up students before and after this fees increase, and I wanted to see about the impact on mental health. So this was 390 people. So this is a measure of kind of overall mental health. And it's a little bit hard to make sense of the graph, but essentially this is over their 4 time points over their first year. Okay. And this here, this line at the top, the solid blue line, is people who are paying the increased fees. And these 2 lines are people who are paying the lower £3,000 to £4,000, all students from Scotland who were paying somewhere between £0 and £3,000. So some of them got for free in Scotland. Now, the only time where there was actually what we'd call a statistically significant difference was here at time 2. So there was one of the 4 time points, people who had more tuition fees were worse mental off, but that kind of disappeared. So it wasn't a particularly big impact. Interestingly, the people who were paying less had more problems with drink. And that may well just be a practical thing, that those who were paying higher tuition fees could not afford to drink as much. So actually the tuition fees amount, how big a student loan, how much debt you were in had very little impact. But struggling to pay the bills increased symptoms over time. So this is, your symptoms getting worse over time. So it shows that you look at how much people are struggling financially, and then how does that predict how their mental health up to a year later, but you control for initially how bad they are. So there's chicken and egg thing. So it's not just the people are depressed or worse with their finances. You're actually looking at, does it make your mental health get worse over time? So depression, anxiety, stress, problem drinking, psychotic symptoms such as unusual sensations, hearing voices, paranoia, and also eating disorder risk for things like bulimia and anorexia. Those all got worse over time. Worth saying regarding the tuition fees, this was only in the first year of their studies, and I have a hunch that you probably won't see the differences between the cohorts for a long time, because people in first year, they're getting into their studies, they're probably having fun, hopefully having fun, and maybe their student loan doesn't impact them. Maybe when they've been graduated 5 years and they're thinking about buying a house, getting married, etc., then there's a difference. So the gap will get bigger over time. Maybe worrying about your student loan isn't that big when you're 21, but when you're 30 and you're still 40 grand in debt. So it may well be that this had a bigger impact. And some economists predict that with the £9,000 increase, the majority of students will never pay off their debt. So I think there may well be a difference emerging now, but I couldn't follow people up that long in that study, unfortunately. But there was also this vicious cycle. Something in my clinical practice I will often see. We often get a vicious cycle between situations such as this. So poor mental health, eating disorder risk led to greater financial difficulties over time, and vice versa. It worked both ways. And I'm sure you can imagine with some of your clients how this is often the case. People get stressed out and depressed about their level of debt. They then bury their head in the sand and avoid opening bills and don't want to get any debt advice, and then it gets worse. One thing I've moved on to look at specifically is about bipolar disorder, because anecdotally, it's in the diagnostic criteria. This is people who have depression, but they also have episodes of mania, hypomania, where they might be very elated, lots of energy, lots of big ideas, very impulsive. And it's in the diagnostic criteria that often people with bipolar disorder will impulsively spend when they're manic. So I did a little bit of a study, this was in Portsmouth, looking at this. So first of all, I interviewed people, and I gave people, writing down qualitative, what we call, they wrote down how their money impacted their mental health and vice versa. So there's a theme here about overspending and impulse shopping when they're manic, which didn't come as a surprise. What did come as a surprise was this idea of excessive generosity, buying friends, family, loved ones loads of presents they can't afford, Some people gave away thousands of money to charity, which they couldn't afford. Anxiety, depression, and often suicidality. So someone there, the very reason I tried to commit suicide 3 years ago. And regret, guilt. So regret about overspending. You know, start to realize, what have I done? What made me buy these things? Poor planning and avoiding. So when people are depressed, when people are anxious, they tend to avoid. So burying your head in the sand, ignoring these demands. Also, some people spoke about this idea of a vicious circle. So I realize I'm spending and putting my family in financial stress, and this leads to larger depression. Then I comfort spend again to cope. Fortunately, people talking about poor employment. So having a mental health problem meant they couldn't work, or they had to take a lower paid job that was flexible maybe, or part-time work, which obviously had a financial impact. And this comfort spending, trying to make yourself feel better when you're feeling down, also merged. So this is a bit of a timeline of how I think it might relate to these mood changes. So this is the cycle of bipolar disorder and mania and depression. So I think people might overspend when they're manic. They become very avoidant when they sort of start to realize when their mood crashes. They feel guilty, they regret it, they feel down, they feel anxious. They maybe bury their head in the sand. One person said, I let my bills pile up to a certain level and then I chuck them in the bin. Some people even feel suicidal. And then maybe there's a vicious cycle where you go back to square one, unfortunately, where people comfort spend to try and make themselves feel better. So I also did some research where I followed up people over time. So I followed people with bipolar disorder up a few months apart. I gave them questionnaires about their mental health, about their finances, and about other psychological factors. And putting that together with these interviews, this is the model I've developed for bipolar disorder. It can get a bit complicated, bear with me. I'm not saying this occurs for everyone with bipolar disorder. I'm saying this is all of the potential mechanisms. You have financial difficulties, but then what is important is perceived financial wellness. So how much you are worrying about your financial situation. This fuels anxiety, and then people might avoid finances because they make them feel anxious. So you're back to square one. People with bipolar disorder tend to have quite high standards, quite perfectionist, very focused on achievement, etc. And we actually found that financial difficulties predicted later impulsive spending, which on the face of it doesn't sound like it makes a whole lot of sense. But actually, what we think is people are broke. They get these big ideas. I need to achieve. I need to get myself out of this. They maybe make a plan to make money, a business idea, get rich quick scheme. Their mood increases. They maybe take a few more risks and are more impulsive. So they spend money to make money. And maybe it's a very grandiose business idea. And they come back to square one. What we also found, and this is in line with those findings about having to go, having a utility disconnected, having to go without buying new clothes, not having enough electricity, that was an important predictor of depression. We think what happens is it really lowers people's self-esteem. They feel really rubbish about themselves. They might feel depressed or suicidal. And then there's two ways this might also relate to impulse spending. First of all, we showed that mindfulness, which you may well have heard of, mindfulness predicted impulsive spending 4 months later. People who were less aware of what was going on, more mindless, were more likely to impulse spend. So I think if you're depressed and your mind's elsewhere, you might be more vulnerable to this. But also there's this thing of comfort spending where people spend money to try and make themselves feel better, but they reported it works for a little bit and then it ends up digging them deeper into a debt hole. The last one was around other people. So people spend and then they regret what happens. Oh, I'm not going to have enough family. My family's going to be angry with me. They then get these thoughts around dependence. They worry, are people going to really hate me for this? My family going to be really angry with me? And then they're overly generous. So one person's comments were about, I get worried I've spent loads of money, so I buy my family presents to make up for it. So a bit more about the psychological mechanisms. So why is it that finances lead to mental health. This is why I'm interested in particular as a psychologist. So first of all, there's some pretty good evidence that actually how stressed people feel about their debt is more important than the actual amount of debt in terms of the impact on depression. So this is an important thing to ask maybe people you're helping, is how worried they are about it. And I'm sure you may probably experience this. £200 over into your overdraft is a massive deal to some people, whereas £2,000 into your overdraft is not a big deal for other people. And of course, there's other impacts on that, like how much your income is, for example. But there's also a psychological element. If you believe your finances are going to get worse, this predicts poor mental health. There's something about worrying that things are going to get worse. There's something about social as well. So there was a study of older adults in China found that their social network and how much they felt they could get help from their kind of community was a buffer. It helped moderate the impact of debt on depression. Another thing that I did a few years ago, we published a review where we went through and looked at all the research that had been done on these psychological mechanisms that link financial difficulties with mental health. And overall, I mean, the subjective, so the stress, the worry about finances is more important than objective measures of finances, like the amount of debt you're in. So how much you worry about it is more important than how much debt you're actually in. So this is kind of the model we developed. So there's objective financial hardship. Can you pay the bills? Are you in debt? Then there's subjective. How much do you worry about it? Do you feel like it's going to get better? Do you feel hopeful? And then what also turned financial hardship into mental health was hopelessness, which linked to poor mental health, stress, and depression, but also shame. This was what we'd call a mediator. They linked these two things. Shame also linked anxiety. So people who are struggling financially become depressed, stressed, because if they're hopeless about it, and then they become anxious if they're really ashamed about their financial situation. So that was a research paper we did of 100 and something people over time. Another thing we did is we did a review of all the research that has been done. So we looked at dozens of papers, and what we found is this link between financial hardship and mental health. There are a few things which were protective. They helped buffer you from the impact of financial problems. So self-esteem, how confident you felt about your own abilities. Personal agency, so whether you felt like you had some control over what was going on. Could you do something about it? And then active coping, trying to do something about it rather than burying your head in the sand, which often people do when they're depressed. So I think a positive thing is, an active coping mechanism which would help buffer there would definitely be coming to you for debt advice, for example. So just actually trying to do something active about it really helps mitigate and reduce the impact of the financial hardship on mental health. So to summarize, people's level of worry and stress about finances and debt is actually more important on their mental health than the amount of debt. Psychological factors like how hopeful people are, how ashamed they are, they really turn these financial struggles into poor mental health. Sense of agency, whether people feel like they can do something about it, they actively cope, and they have, solid self-esteem about whether they can cope and whether they're a good person. They're all they all help buffer. And mental health increases the risk of financial difficulty. So it does work both ways due to avoiding when you're in problems, maybe goal-focused impulse spending, and problems with employment as well. And I think that the impulse spending, one thing I'll say about that as well is that it's not always random. I think it might appear random for people with bipolar disorder, but often there's a goal behind it. What does this mean for your work? Well, anything you can do to help your clients, which I'm sure you already do, feel more in control of their finances is going to really help. So show them what they can do, small changes they can make. Tell them their options financially, a debt relief order or whatever it is, budgeting. Really try and de-shame and destigmatize, normalize financial problems, normalize the impact they can have on your mental health. Tell them how many people you see, because people will really keep this to themselves, and shame grows in secrecy, in the dark. So really just saying, look, this is how many people we've seen this month in Portsmouth alone. I think that's actually going to be really helpful. And increasing hope. I know people are going to feel very hopeless, and I know sometimes there's really difficult financial situations, but maybe telling them about what the outcome could be, what previous clients have had, tell them some of your success stories. You can't guarantee it, but it gives them that little bit of hope. Even if the worst comes and they have to declare bankruptcy, you can think about, okay, how long does that last for? It's 6 years or something. Then what? If you've got examples of people who have gone bankrupt and actually rebuilt a life, tell them about this, because when you're depressed, when you're anxious, you catastrophize about the worst case scenario. So anything to make them feel a little bit more hopeful is going to be really helpful. Okay. These are references to my research that I've published that I just talked about there. And then I've got the references to the other, these are mine as well. And then I've got references to just some of the other papers I talked about, in the unlikely event that anyone wants to read a little bit more. All right, 29 minutes past. Do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah, we will make time for a few questions if you're happy, if we've got some.
Yeah.
Great. So firstly, thanks. That was very interesting. I've taken some notes myself just about, shame grows in secrecy, all this stuff. It's so dark when you're in it, isn't it? It's hard to see that there's a way out of that. So should we give people 30 seconds more in case anyone's got a question they want to type in the box so we can see it that way? Right, a lot of thanks. Obviously, we've got a question here. Just going through. Karen Richardson, question for Dr. Richardson. Maybe relation, maybe you've caused, maybe you've keyed it up. Is there a word for someone who overeats and can't stop? From Karen Richardson.
Well, yeah, I think the diagnostic term would probably be binge eating. There's also bulimia, which is the binge eating, but also comes with might be bouts of restricting, and it might be purging, making yourself sick, or using laxatives to lose weight. But yeah, I think there's definitely increasing recognition. If any of your clients present with that, there is eating disorder service that does cover Portsmouth. There is, like I said, my research showed that overall risk of eating disorder symptoms in student, at least, is increased by financial difficulties. I think the link there is probably something around control. I can't control my financial situation, but maybe I can control what I'm eating and my weight. But as I remember, someone pointed out to me rightly, for people who have bulimia and might eat huge amounts of food and then make themselves sick, it costs a hell of a lot of money to do that.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, there's so many links to a whole host of things that, the effects, isn't it, that debt can really have on people. And I see someone's even put a link there to a site around that particular topic that people can dive into a bit more. So I think question-wise, I think we're covered. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Thomas. We're going to send, I think this pack's recorded, so we'll have all the references and people can review that a little bit at their leisure. But that's fascinating. I've taken, like I say, some notes for myself to look in for. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me, and keep up the great work you do. It's really important what you do. It really is. All right. Take care, everyone.